All right. Welcome, everybody, to the Monday, November 1st edition of Lunch with Lincoln. I am your host for today, Reed Galen, co-founder of the Lincoln Project. Joining me today, the one, the only, the fabulous Maya May, host of We're Speaking Wednesday nights on LPTV. Maya, welcome.
Thank you, Reed. Hello. Good morning, everybody, and afternoon, everybody on the East
Right.
Coast.
It's noon in the East and 9 in the West. So everybody, thanks for joining us. Obviously, it's a very busy time in American politics. We have the Virginia governor's race, hotly contested, coming down tomorrow, November 2nd, against former governor, Democrat Terry McAuliffe, and Republican Glenn Youngkin. It become a very close race, as we said. We sort of took note of it late September. When polls started closing. And so I think, Maya, it's an old adage in politics, always campaign like you're 10 points down, even if you're 10 points up. So, if you do live in Virginia, whether or not you live in Arlington or you live in Bedford or you live in Newport News, Glenn Youngkin, as we call him, Glenn Trumpkin, he may say the right things. He may look like Mitt Romney in his bro vest, but let me tell you something, like, when and if he gets into office, like, the right wing will come for him. They will never leave him alone. And they will, as President Obama said, they will understand he has no core, and he will bend and accede to their wishes, because that he will see that as the path of least resistance. And so I think that get out and vote for Terry. If you've got a ballot in your hands, get it in the mail today, drop it off at a drop box. If you can go vote in person, go ahead and do that tomorrow. We'll send out some stuff on our social channels later today, or just in a little while, about how you can make sure that you're making your voice heard in that very crucial governor's race, which will have so much of a, at least a narrative effect on what people will think will happen in the next year's midterms. So what, you were lucky enough to live 3,000 miles away from Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia. What's your sense of that race as you sit there in Los Angeles?
So, yes, I'm on the other side of the country, but I've been incredibly engaged watching online, and I am optimistic but nervous, partly because I know that the Black vote is crucial, and I want to make sure that people stay engaged. And I know people are coming at the Black vote from all directions. We have conservative candidates trying to puck away the Black vote. We have, candidates on the far left. And so to me right now, I am anxious, because it is so important that everybody get out to vote. We know that high voter turnout is what we need. And so for me, I know that we're all exhausted and we're all frustrated with what sometimes feels like a lack of progress. But I urge everybody to kind of turn that frustration into action, so that we all feel good when this race is over, so that we can use it as motivation to move forward. So that's where I'm at.
Well, I think that's right. And Rick said something late last year. I think it was after the election, after Trump had lost. And he said, the biggest thing that we all have to look out for is that there will be candidates like a Glenn Youngkin who will take Trumpism and run it through the car wash. And, it'll have that new car smell. It'll look pretty and shiny. But the truth is, it's the same vehicle. And I think that Youngkin is a cautionary tale, even when he loses. And I think he will lose, even if closely. Just by the nature of the state, that, we should beware of candidates like this. It used to be in Republican politics that Republicans pretended to be more conservative than they were because of a conservative base, but left them enough wiggle room to come back to the middle to sort of snatch up those independent voters. Now you have to pretend to be moderate enough,
right?
But
he's not fooling anybody. That's the thing. Like, I feel like, at least from the Black community, like, he's not fooling anybody. Like, we know what he means when he's talking about critical race theory. Like, he's not fooling anybody. And I think for people who are paying attention, my bigger concern is the people who are like, let's give him a shot. He hasn't had a shot. Like, now is not the time for let's give him a shot energy. Like, I don't want to see what he's going to do in office, because it's already been proven when we look at other GOP candidates, what they're doing when they feel emboldened. So no giving him a shot.
That was the same sort of, overly cavalier attitude a lot of Republican voters had in 2016 when they're like, well, I don't really like Hillary. And what's the worst that could happen if he was in office? Well, I think we've now seen it,
Yeah.
And we're now experiencing it. But, just to hook onto the thread of Trump, before you and I went on the air, I found this article, or somebody sent this article to one of our threads, and it said, this is from The Guardian today. Almost a third of Republicans believe violence may be necessary to, quote, save the U.S., according to a new poll. Researchers at the Public Religion Research Institute, a nonprofit, found that 30% of Republicans agreed with the statement, quote, because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. It says, among Americans who believe the 2020 election was, quote, stolen from Donald Trump, which it was not, 39% believe violence may be required. So if you are a hardcore Trump supporter, there's a 4 in 10 chance that you think that violence is necessary. There was this earlier survey this year, back in January, post-January 6th, that you had referenced, by the American Enterprise Institute, that found that 39% of Republicans thought that, quote, if elected leaders will not protect America, the people must do it themselves, even if it requires violent actions. So that's pretty heavy stuff to start a Monday morning with. At least it was here in the mountains. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, first of all, I get Trump's emails, Save America. And
Right.
So when you say that, I go, oh, gee, I wonder where that came from. I wonder why people are getting that feeling that they have to save America. Because when it's positioned that way, when that's the narrative that's being built, like, I lost and therefore you now have to save America. Well, of course, people feel like patriots on January 6th. They feel like they're doing the right thing. They're being made to feel like they're doing the right thing, completely forgetting the fact that America is supposed to be about civil discourse and that the only path forward is being able to connect. So it's insane to me. It's frustrating. It's scary because as they're having these thoughts and feelings, that it's kind of like proliferating throughout our states. We're seeing it in school board meetings. Like, that's violent rhetoric, right? Like,
Right.
people are being primed for violence, and we're actually seeing it play out in places where it shouldn't be, like outside of schools, like going after students for wanting to get the vaccine, going after students for wearing masks. Like, we have to be very, very clear and understand this is where we're at right now. Like, it's not even about like, oh, how did we get here? It's like, we are at a place where violence is considered perhaps necessary. That's crazy to me.
Well, and I mean, I guess maybe too, it shouldn't be surprising considering how many, I mean, whether or not it's the trial of Kyle Rittenhouse, the young man who saw what was going on in Kenosha, Wisconsin, had his mother drive him across the border, shot 3 people, 2 of them he killed. Right. And now you have this crazy ass judge up there who says
they're not victims.
He shot and killed couldn't be called victims.
Yeah, not
right?
victims.
Like,
no.
And so the effect of that, I think, is this sort of idea of everything we thought was abnormal is now being normalized.
Exactly.
And I think you saw that too with when the people at the Michigan State Capitol last year, right, marched in with guns and screaming at the governor's door. That is the kind of thing where, it looks like now, as I'm just thinking through this, it looks like now an immediate precursor to what we saw on January 6th, which was these are people who were very angry. They took the literal steps to walk inside a Capitol building, inside the citadel of democracy, whether or not in Washington, D.C. or Lansing, Michigan. But the folks in Washington, D.C. took it to the next level. 5 people died. Right. Damage, both, institutional, physical, emotional, psychological. And now, it looks like people are like, okay, sure. And so, we see the Boogaloo Boys in their Hawaiian shirts and their AR-15s. And that's always been my concern, is that especially on the right, that, it is a very real, a very live threat of violence. We've seen school board members, to your point, now resigning, saying, you know what, like, I don't want to do it. We've seen Congressman Anthony Gonzalez, Republican from Ohio, saying, you know what, I've been in Congress 1 term. I think Donald Trump is a cancer on the country, a cancer on the party. But you know what? I'm done with the death threats against me and my family. I'm out. And I think that's the other concerning part, is that It doesn't take, sometimes it only takes the threat of violence to get otherwise good, decent, brave, and honorable people to say, you know what, like, I believe in this stuff, but I'm not putting myself on the line for it.
Right. Or my
And
family.
I mean, and as much as it could, and can you blame them, I guess, right? Can you blame them in the face of having to look their families in the eyes, their friends in the eyes and say, you're really going to do this? It's a hard decision.
It truly is, but it's a worthy decision to consider staying in, because this is where we do need good people to stand up and say violence is not the answer when you are frustrated. And I think sometimes we feel like we can't speak up, and to speak up all of a sudden, and I think this is true with people who are empathetic, like we're always considering how the other party will feel. Right. And so we feel like, oh, like they're screaming, but if we also scream, then we're as bad as them, and da 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 da. And it's like, no, I'm not telling people to fight violence with violence. I'm saying speak reason to it, speak up and say, hey, like across the board, violence isn't going to get us anywhere. But we do have to be mindful of the tactics that we are using, because we're at a point, like I was having this conversation earlier, I feel like, the GOP kind of has like this grip on the throat of American democracy, right? And it's like trying to choke it out. And when something is being choked out, like it's not about reason trying to get back up, right? It's about like we have to kind of like shout out and say, hey, like this isn't normal. We shouldn't be at a point where the GOP has their grip on the throat of democracy, but they do. And so we kind of have to like use all the tactics that are necessary, that are within reason to be able to fight back.
It's a fight or flight response, right? Like if someone was doing that to you, your entire being's natural instinct is to do everything it can to save itself, right? Your lizard brain takes over, right? Your parasympathetic neurology or whatever the hell it is, right? Like the same thing that keeps you breathing without thinking about it is now going, get these hands off of me.
Right.
But if you don't, then you're like, okay, I'm out. Right. I'm just going to succumb to it. Right. And I think that's the hard part, right? Which is people have to make a decision, fight or flight. And to your point about the tactics, I mean, look, we knew this, like Rick and I talk about this going back to 2019, right? Sitting with very reasonable, thoughtful people talking about how you're going to beat Donald Trump. And they're like, we have to make him look bad, right? We have to take him on policy. It's got to be about China trade. Now, remember, this is all pre-pandemic, right? None of us knew that was going to happen. And we're all like, this is not going to work, right? It's the same reason why, like, when you try and put out an oil fire, you don't use water, right? Because it just spreads, right? What do you have to do? You have to deprive it of oxygen, right? That's how you do it. And that's like what we tried to do last year. And I think what we try and do this year, which is you have to find whether or not it's whether or not it's Donald Trump as an individual or whether or not it's something like critical race theory, you have to cut it off and say, you're not going to use this. And I think what you see too, Maya, is whenever you do hold that mirror up, especially about race, as you know, it drives the right-wing frenzy machine into overdrive.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely into overdrive. And you can always pretty much tell if that's happening, then it's happening because they know it's a weak spot, right? That they know that they have no good answer for it, either because they believe it or they don't believe it, but they believe that they need to use those dog whistles, that coded language, barely coded at this point,
right,
to scare white suburban voters typically.
Right. And it's interesting because I think it might scare older white suburban voters, which is why I think the youth vote is so important, in particular in Virginia, because every time I talk to a college student, for the most part, they're expecting diversity. They're expecting pragmatism. They want things that older generation might be afraid of. For them, it's just kind of like par for the course that, of course, everybody should be included. People's voices should be heard. And so I think these dog whistles might work on older voters, but not so much on the younger voters. So I'm hoping the youth vote. Get out there, vote. We need you.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that is as Whitney Houston liked to say, the children are our future. Unfortunately, as you know, when you're young, anytime between, let's say, the ages of 15 and 30, you believe you're going to live forever, right? You're very much in the moment, which we've seen has an electoral effect, which is youth vote is typically very poor. You know, I mean, they talk about when President Obama was running, or then Senator Obama was running, that it went up, but it was because he drove so many more people, right? I believe the percentage of younger voters, let's say 18 to 25, wasn't higher as a percentage of total turnout. It was just there were more of them. And I think that's right. In trying to hone folks in a time when, you know, so much of their life is lived on this thing, right? And you know, everybody's, you know, attention span is so short, is sometimes a very difficult case to make when you know, we see these. I believe, Maya, these are existential times. I mean,
right.
We only have a couple of years to get this right, and if we don't, I mean, look, you used to live in Argentina, right?
Yeah.
Argentinians probably believe believe that they live in a democracy. Maybe they don't. I don't know, but nobody believes it, right? Like, they vote every year, but do they believe it's going to change anything?
You know, so it's interesting because I remember when I was living in Argentina from 2005 to 2013. And so I remember when it was possible that Christina Kirchner wasn't going to have a peaceful transfer of power. And I remember how crazy that sounded there. And I thought, God, at least in the US, things are stable. Things don't work that way. And so I was very excited when I moved back to the US at the end of 2013, 2014. The idea that we are at a point where the peaceful transfer of power is now something that is not a guarantee is frightening, because it does mean that many people in our country, that those people who are willing to resort to violence or think that violence might be necessary, actually don't believe in a peaceful transfer of power. They believe in taking power and using violence to keep power, and which just kind of goes to show you how much they're willing to defend what they believe should be the way of life in America, which is an America for, I guess, for white people by white people. I think that's what they're going for.
Well, I mean, yes, I think there's always been a racial component of that. One that's, you know, has been addressed, never properly, or fully addressed, never properly followed through on. And it seems to be, you know, I mean, these are not new fights, right? I mean, these go back hundreds of years potentially. And certainly we saw the last, you know, before 2020, before even really the mid 2010s, you know, the civil rights movement generated a lot of anger and heat amongst typically Southern whites, but things like busing, right, was, you know, I mean, that's even in the ad that we ran about critical race theory, you know, that was one of the things Lee Atwater, who was George H.W. Bush's campaign manager in 1988, said, you can't use this word, but you can say forced busing. And then forced busing becomes welfare queens. And then welfare queens becomes critical race theory. Like, there's an evolution here. It's not a secret. The question is, I guess, Maya, for you, is why aren't folks, you know, who know better, who aren't, you know, who don't traffic in that, more willing to call it out more often? Like, what's the hesitation from your perspective? Is it just a general discomfort with it? What do you think it is?
I think it's general discomfort. I think not everybody is outspoken about the things that they believe because they're afraid of that judgment, except for the youth. And I wanted to, there's a bit of a myth that the youth vote, when they actually are registered, there is a pretty good engagement. And so I think part of the problem is with adults, everybody's trying to protect their status quo, right? Everybody wants to, so therefore, as long as you don't make a decision that's too far to this way or too far to that way, and you just kind of mainstream things, you get to protect your status quo. But what we're seeing now, what's different is, like, the status quo, it's like been thrown out the window. Like, there was, after January 6th, I think that's the point where a lot of people had to step back and go, oh, and that's when we did see more people speaking up. After what happened to George Floyd, we saw more people speaking up. And so I think, even though, because I want to stay optimistic, I think even though things feel dire right now, I think we are at a point where people are saying, no, this messaging, the dog whistling, the racism, the critical race theory, it's all losing messaging. It's messaging for losers, if you will, I would say, because it's basically like throwing strategy at the wall that is only working for a segment of their voters, of their base. And I think what we're seeing is, with the youth vote, with people who are being more reasonable, they're slowly going to push that kind of messaging to the wayside. It's not going to work. That's what I hope. That's the
Well, look,
optimist in me.
I hope that too. And I mean, I think this is one thing that, I don't want to say we forget it, because we don't, because it stares us in the face. But, we only have, voters in this country really only have two choices, right? And so more often than not, they will choose the person they think will do them the least harm, to your point, right? That they think is the least bad option that will allow them to live their lives as they prefer it, in, relatively speaking, peace and, harmony. But now that doesn't seem to be the case, as you said, whether or not it's in Texas or Florida or wherever. What you're seeing is a bunch of, otherwise conservative Republicans who don't believe in government control, utilizing the government to do all sorts of things that otherwise should just, if they just didn't do anything or didn't say anything or were helpful to the cause, there'd be more people, kids wouldn't have such chaotic school, lives. The pandemic in a place like Florida, would not have rampaged through the state like it has, and in Texas and a lot of southern states. People would be getting vaccinated rather than getting thousands of dollars worth of, very expensive antibody treatments or $1 million ICU bills. And so I think that's the other part too, is that they, to your point about this narrow wedge of what I would call primary Republican voters, right? They are doing that at the expense of the other, 75, 80% of their citizenry, right? It's not even the electorate. It's the people that they're supposed to represent.
And people are paying attention. I think what they forget now is that there are records for all of this. So everybody can go back and look at screenshots. Everybody can go back and look at their lives, their bills, the people who they've lost, and go, okay, what the GOP is doing is not working. It is not helpful for me, and even the stuff with like the vaccine mandates and the mask mandates. And this weekend I was like, I was like, nobody's mad at helmet laws. And so I Googled to see about helmet laws, because I was even thinking about
crazy.
But people went crazy in the 90s when they instituted the helmet laws. But like all these same people who were talking about like they want their freedom aren't rallying against helmet laws. So it's just interesting to me when we really pay attention to what's being fought about and how they're just creating all of this drama, and then everybody can just kind of look at it and go, oh, it's obvious what you're doing, and we're not going to fall for it.
If the helmet law had been, accompanied by, and by the way, if you're not wearing a helmet on your motorcycle and you get in a terrible life-threatening crash, we will leave you on the side of the road, like people would have gone equally crazy. So, well, you can't do that, right? Well, okay. So what you're saying is you want the freedom to fly off a two-wheel vehicle going 70 miles an hour into the trunk of a car in front of you. And you want us to be responsible for your bad decision.
Yeah. Which that would be the parallel.
Right. And I mean, I think the same, you go back to the 80s, the same thing with the seatbelt. I haven't worn a seatbelt my whole life. I'm not going to start now. Okay. Like, somebody, whether or not it's you, your family, your insurance company, is going to pay in, money, is going to pay in time lost, is going to pay in anguish and heartache and everything else. And that's what's fascinating to me is, it's like these folks, they either don't care what their family has to say. I mean, I don't know how many friends I have. They're like, oh yeah, you can't tell my dad anything about it. You can't tell my mom anything about it. Like, they're not going to get vaccinated. They're not going to do it. My brother-in-law won't do it. Like, don't even bring it up because he's just convinced it doesn't matter. But
history shows us that reason wins out, because now there are literally helmet laws everywhere except for, I think, Illinois, and maybe New Hampshire. And there's a few states where they don't have motorcycle helmet laws. And so eventually, with time, reason wins out, which is why I think it's crazy for the GOP to put all of their strategy into these wedge issues that don't make any sense. People figure it out eventually. People figure out that critical race theory isn't being taught in schools. So I'm staying optimistic.
So I just, I'm looking through the comments here, and Riley on YouTube says the LP folks are great at what they do, but I wonder why they don't offer insights about what we, the people, can actually do. So Maya, what would you say to Riley?
So what we can actually do. So one, I think we can be strategic as individuals, strategic and motivated, and have these conversations and understand how to engage in civil discourse, right? And so when we see, for example, because everything that happens in our worlds now happens in the virtual world, if you will. People are on Facebook, people are having arguments, people are trying to convince people of things, and then it scales, right? And we see it and it goes viral. I think one really important thing that we can do is be the voice of reason in these conversations, which means educating ourselves about what the actual issues are and pointing things out like, oh, this is violent rhetoric, and this is where violent rhetoric leads to. I think you can engage with people in your community, with your friends and family, and have those conversations and say, hey, talk to 5 people this week and say, make a commitment. Like, how sometimes we make a commitment to like, okay, it's, I'm not going to drink in this month. I think, right. I'm not sure what people do. There's like no drink November or whatever. How about not get engaged in crazy discourse,
right.
October, November, like pick something and say, hey, this is what we're going to commit to. And then have those conversations, because once you build that muscle and you can do that and you can stay calm in a conversation, right. those kind of like crazy arguments that escalate and then you end up saying something that you regret and then that ruins your whole day, that'll start to go away. And so right. That's what I say is make a commitment to having civic engagement with people who might disagree with you.
Well, and I would say this, I mean, look, you can always, you can always sign up with us, lincolnproject.us. We will have active ground yes. operations in the states in which we're operating next year. I will say that you could go to our sister organization, the Franklin Project, franklinproject.us, that's got so many resources of the kind that Maya's talking about, where you can learn how to have those civil discourses. Again, just think about this, guys. First and foremost, the only way to get what Maya's talking about to scale is if all of us do it individually, right? Yes. It can't be like I sit on the air and say, talk to people and get them to recognize their cognitive dissonance. And, it'll happen 52 million times. It's going to happen one person and one person, over a long time, or you have to hold the mirror up. It's Steve Hassan, who we've had on both this show and on the podcast, who was actually a member of a cult in the 70s and talks about what it meant to be deprogrammed. Basically was that it was, conversation after conversation with his family where, it took, a lot of this discourse, a lot of the, highlighting this cognitive dissonance to get it done. Now, more practically speaking, also, you can go to iwillvote.com. You can go to, your local, whether or not it's League of Women Voters or Democratic Party, if you're a Democrat, to understand how you can get involved. First and foremost, if you're not registered to vote, you should register to vote. Sign up to be a poll worker or an election observer. Certainly get out, make sure all your friends and family vote. Those are the things. And then I would say this, as we get, Virginia is, 24 hours away, right? Maybe 36 hours away, depending on where you are, from the polls being closed. Like if you have friends in Virginia, make sure they get out to vote. And just as I said, what we look at next year is going to have to be a grand and broad coalition in all of these states, right? It's Trump will be on the ballot in some ways, but it won't be like it was last year because he was just so in the middle of everything, folks. So it's going to come down to these individual states in these gubernatorial races, in these individual states in these U.S. Senate races, in these individual states in these U.S. House races, where the margin's going to be hundreds of votes, maybe thousands of votes. We cannot take any one of them for granted. And so we'll be publishing, what we're seeing as our target list here shortly in the next couple of weeks, and we'll get that out to everybody. But I would say this, as Maya said, like, if it just starts with one conversation, I know that seems overly simplistic, but it's not, because being willing to do that is a huge start in all of this other stuff. And I think Maya's absolutely right. As everybody said, it's really easy to get discouraged. Really, really easy to get discouraged. But I would say this, guys, is, I saw, it's a great bumper sticker, right? Like when you're exhausted, the answer is not to quit, but to rest. And so, if you got to rest up for a little while, that's fine. But what we need is y'all's commitment, because without y'all, right, it's just me and Maya talking on a screen for 30 minutes. Without y'all, like, it doesn't get done. And so Maya, anything you can leave our folks with to just give our week a little bit of an uplift as we get out of here?
Yes, I do want to speak to what you just said and the consistency of it and the rest. I love to work out. That's my big thing, and so I like to sometimes look at it like a HIIT workout, like a HIIT cardio workout. And so you have times of intensity, and then you have times of rest. You have times of intensity and then times of rest. And the important is to know which one is which. And when we fix things that are the fundamental level, which is our mindset, which is having faith that we can actually get through this, then the actual actions become easy. Those things about registering to vote, talking to other people to vote, about getting out the vote, like that all becomes easy as long as we protect the fundamentals, which is our mindset about how we feel about living in a democracy. So protect your mindset this week. That is that is my advice to everybody.
Well, amen to that. Maya, I want to thank you for joining me today. Everybody out there, thank you for joining us on Monday's edition of Lunch with Lincoln. We will see you later this week. And as always, thanks everybody for joining us. Have a great week.